Alright everybody, make sure this video has sound. I wrote this in case someone is looking at a video with no sound, and make sure everybody can hear it. Hopefully they'll be able to get their speakers up and going and be able to hear me. So you see that sign. This is Chapter 3, Section 5, Part 2 in the Chapter 3 study guide for geometry. Now, I'm actually going to start, I wrote myself a little note there as you can see. I'm actually going to start with a section that I wrote on the last page. What I'd like to determine here is whether these lines are parallel, whether these two lines are perpendicular, or whether they are neither one. So as you can see, I've written out several examples of lines, and I want to figure out whether they fall into one of these three categories. Now, if you remember from the last section, we talked about parallel lines having the same slope. Remember, the slope number is the number that comes right before the x. So this one has a slope of 3, a slope of 3, slope of -5, slope of 1/5, slope of 7, slope of -7. That's where you go to find the slopes. And if the slopes are exactly the same, then the two lines are parallel. If the slopes multiply together, and you get -1 as your answer, then they're perpendicular. And if they're not the same, and they don't multiply to be -1, then they would be neither. They're not parallel nor perpendicular. So, are these two slopes the same? Yes. So these two lines are parallel. Are these two slopes the same? No, they're not parallel. Well, they might be perpendicular if they multiply together to be -1. Does -5 multiply with 1/5 to be -1? Well, if you multiply across the top, you get -5. On the bottom, you have 5. And so -5 divided by +5 is -1. Ah, they do multiply together to be -1. How about the next example? Are those two the same number? No. This one's +7, this one's -7. Those are two very different numbers. So, no. These two lines are not parallel. Are they perpendicular? Well, can we multiply these two numbers together and get -1? No, they don't give you -1. So these two lines are neither parallel nor perpendicular. Neither one. How about these two? Are these two slope numbers the same, 2/3 and -3/2? No. So these two lines are not parallel. Are they perpendicular? Can you multiply those two slopes together to give you -1? Well, let's see. On the top, we get -2 when we multiply straight across. And on the bottom, we get +6. Did I say -2? I meant -6. And on the bottom, we get +6. And can you divide -6 by +6? Absolutely. You get -1. Ah, so, again, we have a perpendicular pair. The slopes multiply together to be -1. Okay, let's do a few more. How about this one? The slope here is -1. Remember, when there's no coefficient written in front of an x variable, you can assume that it's 1. In this case, it would be -1. In this case, it would be +1. Are those two the same numbers? -1 and +1? No. So these two lines are not parallel. Are they perpendicular? If I take the slope here, which is -1, and multiply it by the slope there, which is +1, do I get -1? Ah, I do. So these two lines here are perpendicular. Number 6. Are these two numbers exactly the same? Slope here is 75, slope here is 75. Yes. So those two lines are parallel. And then finally, number 7 example. We have two slopes here. One is -9 and the other one is 1/9 positive. So are these two the same exact number? No. So they're not parallel. If they multiply together to be -1, then they'd be perpendicular. Let's see what we get when we multiply. Slope on the top, multiply it by that one, slope on the bottom. If I multiply straight across, I get -9 on the top, and on the bottom I just have 9. Do these divide out to be -1? -9 divided by +9? Yes, it does give you -1. So those two lines are perpendicular. Okay, so a lot of the C-level part of the quiz is going to be like this. The other part is they're going to give you 2 points, and they want you to find the slope. And if those two slopes match, then those lines are parallel, and if they don't match, then they're not. So let's see. If I have, I'm going to use my extra notes page. I'm going to keep using these notes pages. Okay, so for example, trying to find a good example here. Parallel lines. One second. Oh, you're looking at a blank page. I know that's very exciting stuff there. Okay, so let's try. I'm going to go back in the book 1 second. I'm just trying to find a good example so I don't have to start all over again. With the parallel concept. All right. Okay, here we go. Got it. All right, so they're going to say you have line A that goes through points -3, 0, and 0, 2, and you have line B that goes through points 0, 0, and 3, 2. So they want to know if these two lines are parallel. So what you can do is compare the slopes. Obviously, you have to find them first. So if you have x sub 1, y sub 1, and x sub 2, y sub 2, you can say that the slope can be found by taking y sub 2 minus y sub 1 over x sub 2 minus x sub 1. I'll write that up here. If you haven't got that memorized, you probably want to write it yourself. Okay, so I will. 2 take away 0 is 2. 0 minus -3 is +3. So the slope of the first line is 2/3. How about the slope of the second line? Well, the slope would be 2 minus 0 over 3 minus 0, which is 2/3. Oh, see how the slopes are the same? 2/3 positive? Well, are these two lines parallel? That's the question. Well, yes, they are, if they have the same slope. Oops, I missed an L. There we go. Parallel. Yes, they are parallel. They have the same slope. Okay, how about another example just like that? I'm going to use the bottom half of this page. Let's call this example number 1 and example number 2. Okay, so let's say I have line K that goes through the points 0, 2, and 4, 0. And line N that goes through the points -1, 1 and 3, 3. Okay. Are these two lines parallel or not? What do you think? Okay, well, find the slope, right? So we have y sub 1 and y sub, or x sub 1 and y sub 1, x sub 2 and y sub 2. So the slope for line K would be 0 minus 2 over 4 minus 0. So that would give you -2 over 4, which we can reduce this fraction by dividing each of these numbers by 2 to be -1/2. Okay, well, how about the slope of this line N? So y sub 2 minus y sub 1 over x sub 2 minus x sub 1 would give me 2/4, which is 1/2. Okay, well, it seems to me that these two lines would not be parallel because one of them has a negative slope and one of them has a positive slope. It's not the same number. -1/2 and +1/2 are not the same. They're two different numbers, not the same. So are these two lines parallel? My answer would be no. And if I was asked to explain why, I would say, hey, the slopes are not the same, and I would show my work. So how would we figure out if we have perpendicular lines? Well, we would look at the two slopes, and if they multiplied together to be -1, then they'd be perpendicular. So does -1/2 multiply with +1/2 to be -1? No. -1/2 times +1/2 would be -1/4, not -1. So if I asked you if these two lines are perpendicular, the answer would also be no. Okay, so let's see what we can do about getting ready for some B-level questions. So on the quizzes, the B-level questions are going to be kind of like this and like this. So we'll do a few examples from here and there. So let's see, example number 7. See if we can find that in my packet. All right. Here we go. Number 7 asks to write an equation of a line that passes through point P and is parallel to this line. Okay, so you have two different lines going on here. You have the line that you're trying to find the equation for, and then you have this other line. So your line is parallel to this line, which has a slope of -1/2, which means that your line also has a slope of -1/2 because you're assuming those two lines we're talking about are parallel. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the slope from that other line as the slope from my line. They're not the same line. They're next to each other, perhaps, but they're parallel to one another, not exactly the same line. All right. Now, how would I be able to find the equation for this line if all I know is the slope? If I want to write the y equals mx plus b format, that's your slope-intercept form of a line, I'm missing the b value. And without a graph to see it automatically, there is one way to figure it out. What you can do is you can take the y value from the point that's on your line, that's this one. This point is not on this line, it's on your line, and put it right here. Take the slope that we know is true about our line, substitute that in for m. The x value, we can use -2 because this point is on our line, not this other line. You can always use it in an equation with the line you're trying to find. and then we don't know our b value. That's what we're trying to find. Well, the good thing is that with equations, as long as you can fill everything else in with numbers and there's only one variable that is unknown, you can solve for that. So that's what we'll do. To find b, I'll multiply -1 times -2, which is +2. On the bottom, I just have 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. And in order to solve for b, all I have to do is subtract 1 from both sides. So my b value is -1. So my equation for this line would be y equals my slope number, which is -1/2, followed by x, plus my b value, which I just found to be -1. So we can go through that process again. This is the line, this is a point on the line that we're trying to find. This is our line right here, a point on our line. Another line that exists on the graph is this one. We know that our line and this line are parallel, so that means we can assume that the slopes are the same. So I know that my line goes through this point, and I also know the slope of my line is 4. So all I need to do to create slope-intercept form would be to find my b value. So I'll substitute in 9 for y. That's a point value of y in my line. The corresponding x is 3. My slope is 4 because I stole it from the parallel line to my line. And then, since the b is the only unknown, we can solve for that. 9 equals 12 plus b. Solve by subtracting 12 on both sides. So b equals -3. So the equation for my line is y equals my slope value of 4 times x plus my b value, which is -3. And the last one having to do with parallel lines is number 9. So here's a point on my line. There's an x and a y value there. And this is another line that is parallel to my line. And I can see here that it has a slope of -2. So since it's parallel with my line, I know that my line would also have a slope of -2. So all I need to do now is figure out what my y-intercept value is. That's my b value. So I'll take the x and y values of a point I know is on my line. -4 equals -2 is the slope, x value of -5 plus b. Substitute them into the basic format for slope-intercept, and we have an equation that we can solve for b, our unknown. So I get solving here, and I get -14 for my value of b. So my equation for the line that goes through this point that is parallel to this line would be y equals -2x plus -14. Sometimes I get asked, is there another way to write that? Yeah, instead of writing plus a -1 and plus a -3 and plus -14, you could simply write subtraction. So this one could alternately be written as y equals -1/2x minus 1. This one could be y equals 4x minus 3. And this one could be y equals -2x minus 14. Either way is perfectly good in my opinion. Okay, and then the other B-level questions that you'll see are very similar to 10, 11, and 12. So if you have a line that is perpendicular to the line you're trying to find the equation of. So there's two lines, there's your line and the other line. Okay, you do not know what the slope of your line is. That's the tricky part here, everybody. Your line is not going to have the same slope to a line that's perpendicular to it, right? Those are different numbers. So if the other line has a slope of 1/2, your line's not going to have the same slope. This other line over here has a slope of 1/2, so your line, the one that's perpendicular to it, is going to have a very different slope. So how do we figure that out? Well, I know that if two lines are perpendicular and you take 1/2 times the slope of the line we're trying to find, m, that the answer should be -1, right? The slopes of perpendicular lines multiply together to be -1. So if I multiply both sides by 2 here, two times 1/2 is 1 m. That basically allows me to cancel the coefficient in front. 1m is the same as m. And then 2 times -1 is -2. So what number, if I multiply it by 1/2, gives you -1? -2. So for number 10, I know that the slope of my line would have to be -2. And you can go ahead and test that out. When you multiply -2 times 1/2, is the answer -1? Yeah, -2 times 1 is -2. On the bottom you have 2. Is that equal to -1 when you divide? Yeah. So I know that the slope of my line over here for number 10 must be -2. Now, they also gave me some more information about my line. They gave me a coordinate point, which has an x value and a y value to it. And that helps me to figure out all the numbers that I need in my equation, because now I have the m value of -2, but I do not have the b value. My y-intercept value is missing. So what I can do is any point on my line, I can put those two numbers in together simultaneously into any equation if I need to solve for something else. So I know my y value is 20 as long as my x value is 5, and then I know the slope is -2. So I can find my y-intercept value by solving for b now. I'm going to add 10 on both sides, so I get b equals 30. So the equation for my line, the one that's perpendicular to this other line, is y equals -2x plus 30. I don't think I'm going to have enough space to do all the rest of these, so I think I'm just going to skip number 12 to make sure I have space to fully explain and write down my full answer to number 11. Okay, so you have a line that goes through the point 4, 5. They're giving you an x and a y value to use if you need it. Then, this line is perpendicular to your line. So if you have this line having a negative slope, slope here is -1/3, and your line is perpendicular to that line, obviously the slopes are going to be different. So how do you figure out the slope of your line? Well, you'd have to figure out what number you can multiply with -1/3 in order for the answer to be -1. Now, you can either do what I did in the first part for number 10. You could put an m here and then, do some solving. You could multiply both sides by 3 and then divide by -1, perhaps. Or you could multiply by the reciprocal. Or you could just think about it. What number would this be? If I multiplied this by what number, how could I get to -1? Well, what I see is 3, because if you put a 3 on the top, that'll cancel the 3 on the bottom, and then the only number left over will be -1. And there you go. Your answer is -1. So if the slope of the other line that's perpendicular to my line is -1/3, then the slope of my line would have to be +3. Again, those two multiplied together gives you -1. So we know that that would be perpendicular lines, excuse me. Okay. So now that I know that the slope of my line is 3, and I know that it goes through the point 4, 5, in order to find the equation for the line, all I have to do is some substitution to find the last number that I still need, which is b, our y-intercept value. So a y value I could use is 5, as long as I use the accompanying x value, which is 4. The slope I know is 3, and so finding my b value, 3 times 4 is 12, and then I'd subtract 12 on both sides to get a b value of -7. Okay, so my equation, I have all the things I need. I have my m value and I have my b value, so my slope-intercept form is y equals 3x plus -7, or y equals 3x minus 7.